You can hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, I think we're about to go live. If not, we are already live. There's two people waiting at me. Yes, we are now live. And we'll start promptly at 8:30.
Don't go too close to the screen. Relax.
Just under a minute and we about to go. Sanbonani Nonke, a very good evening or good day, depending on where you are, to all our viewers. My name is Selvan Naidoo. I represent the 1860 Heritage Center as your host for the Zoom conference in tribute to Dr. Yenuga Reddy. I would like to acknowledge our principal guest, Dr. Yenuga Reddy, Order of the Companions of O.R. Tambo, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations from 1983 to 1985, Director of the United Nations Center Against Apartheid from 1976 to 1984. I would like to acknowledge our panelists, Dr. Mongane Wally Serote, Mem Ella Gandhi, Dr. Sam Ramsamy, Professor Uma Dhupelia-Mesthrie, Professor Kalpana Hiralal, Dr. Betty Govindan, Kiru Naidoo, Advocate Zandile Kono Reddy, and her mum, Dr. Sinthi Kono. Before I hand over to our chairperson, Professor Jairam Reddy, I'd like to ask Nirod Bramdo, a director of the 1860 Heritage Center, to welcome you. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust that you enjoy this in-conversation tribute. Nirod Bramdo.
Nirod, can you hear us?
Dr. Wally Mongane Serote is joining us. Nirod hasn't joined us as yet.
Dr. Serote, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much, sir.
You can hear us?
I can hear you very well.
Good.
Okay, Professor Reddy, we'll hand over to you and we can begin.
All right, you're not able to locate Nirod.
He's just joined. Unfortunately, the microphone is not on. We're just waiting for him to get activated.
All right, maybe he'll come in later.
Okay, so I hand over to you and we begin the program.
Thank you very much, Selvan. Perhaps at the outset, I should mention Selvan Naidoo. He's a curator of the 1860 Heritage Center. He works tirelessly in upholding the traditions and work of the center. He has put this webinar together with a lot of hard work and coordinate the panel. Much appreciated, Selvan, for all the work you are doing at the center. And I should perhaps thank Nirod at the outset. He's a member of the board of the Heritage Center. And thank you for hosting this, History Society meeting this evening. And Nirod, over to you. I think that we just missed you, but this is an opportunity for you to make your opening remarks. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Jairam Reddy and Dr. Serote. I just wanted to make a few remarks that the 1860 Heritage Center is a center that is devoted to the history of indentured Indian slaves that were brought to South Africa. And it celebrates the triumph of their journey through South Africa as an integral part of the social fabric and the makeup of South Africa, and their contribution to the liberation against oppression. So that's all I want to say, and I just want to keep it short and brief. And I want to say welcome to all of you on behalf of the board and our chairman, and on behalf of you also, our chairman in this process, Professor Reddy. Thank you.
Naidoo, if I may just repeat, please convey our gratitude to the board of the 1860 Heritage Center for hosting this History Society meeting this evening. Very much appreciated, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
Colleagues, it gives me much pleasure to welcome viewers and participants to this History Society webinar based at the 1860 Heritage Center from different parts of the world, and our panelists, in particular, our honored guest, Mr. ES Reddy, who you already heard from Selvan. He's speaking to us this afternoon, or this evening here, from Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts, where I believe it is about 2:30 in the afternoon, and it is a balmy, sunny afternoon there, whereas freezing here in Durban. We will proceed with this conversation as follows. I'll provide a brief overview of the work that Mr. Reddy has undertook over the last 35 years at the United Nations in mobilizing the world community to oppress the doctrine of apartheid. I'll follow up with a few questions, and then I will hand over to the panelists, and each panelist will have 5 to 8 minutes to make some remarks and then to engage with ES Reddy. Kalpana Hiralal will then bring the conversation to an end with some concluding thoughts. And finally, I understand, Betty Govenden, you have a poem that you wish to read, which you have specially composed for this evening. Allow me to begin on a personal note. My association with ES, if I may call you that, goes back some 30 years when he first visited South Africa in the early 1990s. At the time, he stayed with us in the rector's residence at the then University of Durban, Westville. You may remember that, yes, in the early 1990s. You will recall, ladies and gentlemen, those 1990s were really momentous times. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the impending reunification of Germany. Here in South Africa, Nelson Mandela had been released, unbanning of the ANC and other political parties. The ANC had their first National Congress at the campus of the University of Durban, Westville, and the CODISA negotiations kicked off to construct a constitution for us. I recall when he has visited us, many a conversation with him, this softly spoken gentleman who had played such a heroic part in the struggle against apartheid. Whenever you or I would visit a family or friend, it would be customary for us to take a bunch of flowers, a box of chocolates, or perhaps a bottle of wine. Not so with ES Reddy. When he visited Fatima Mehr, or Ila Gandhi, or any of the activists, he would offer them one of his precious documents, a speech he made at the United Nations, perhaps a report of a conference on an anti-apartheid resolution, and so on. He had a formidable collection of documents which he has bequeathed to many universities across the world. In keeping with that tradition, he has brought along with him the tape recording of the acceptance speech made by Albert Luthuli when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Oslo on the 11th of December, 1961. Off we went with those tapes to the Luthuli home in Gradville, near Stanger. We were warmly welcomed by Luthuli's wife, Nokukanya, who was alive, hale and hearty at the time. The photograph, if Selvan can, show it, shows the modest home where he lived in, and shows, in a moment, if you will see it, the Kukanya pouring over with animation over those tapes that she had received from ES. This was the Luthuli residence, which is now part of the Luthuli Museum in Gradville. It houses much of the documentation of Albert Luthuli. And now it is not only that, but it is a vibrant center for music and other cultural activities. Our foreign viewers, you should not miss a visit to this gem of a place about an hour's drive from Durban. There you see, colleagues, the modest Luthuli home where Luthuli spent all his life. Since that time, we met every 2 years when I went to New York and had lunch or dinner with ES. The last time we met was about a year ago in July of 2019 when my wife and I visited our daughter in Boston. ES has now moved to Boston and shares a home with his wife, 2 daughters and nephew. ES and his family graciously hosted us to dinner, and at the time I broached the possibility of inviting him to the 1860 Heritage Center for the History Society meeting. And so we are delighted, ES, that you can join us in this discussion from Boston. A striking feature of his home, as you can see, we are in his lounge, and you know here, the mountain of books. And his nephew tells me this is not enough. His nephew is on the left there, his daughter in front, ES on the right, and my wife on the left there, and ES's wife is behind him. And there are many books and boxes to be unpacked, you know, from the basement. After a discussion with Selvan, I contacted ES to find out a suitable time and date for this webinar. ES agreed to this date and added at once, hope this meeting is not going to be about me, but more about the struggle. Despite his considerable achievements in the anti-apartheid struggle, ES's humility and modesty is a deeply defining part of his character. Never looking for credit or recognition, but soldiering on relentlessly on a course of action with deep commitment. Those of you who may remember a few weeks ago at a Zoom meeting, we honored the late George Chaiperson, the NIC president. Speaker after speaker at that Zoom meeting remarked about the humility and his deep commitment to the struggle. These are the kinds of selfless, servant, authentic, transformative leaders with integrity and vision who constituted the vanguard of the anti-apartheid struggle. Inigo Srinivasulu Reddy was born in Andhra Pradesh, India on the 1st of July, 1924. I am generously mentioning his middle name, Srinivasulu, because in case the EFF may want to use it. His father, Narasa Reddy, was a follower of Gandhi in the small town of Gadur, he recalls, in 1933, when ES was barely 9 years old, that his mother gave all his jewels to Gandhi when he visited the town to collect funds for the upliftment of the Harijans or the untouchables in those days. ES's political consciousness was shaped by both Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. After completing his BA at the University of Madras, ES left by boat for the US in 1943, and in due course, he completed a master's degree in political science at New York University, after which he did postgraduate studies at Columbia University. His interest in South Africa was sparked by 2 pamphlets. One was by Dr. Yusuf Dadoo on the struggle in South Africa, another by Peter Abrams about mine workers going to Johannesburg. He has spent 35 years at the United Nations, first as an intern in 1949. He then progressed to the position of Principal Secretary of the Special Committee Against Apartheid. Then he was director of the Center Against Apartheid. And in 1983, he became Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations. ES is regarded as the most influential of the UN officials, working behind the scenes, ensuring that the United Nations not only represented governments, but also helped build bridges between liberation movements and their supporters around the world. I want to just conclude my brief introduction about ES with a quotation, and the quotation is by Nobel Peace Prize awardee and former United Nations Commissioner for Namibia, Sean McBride, who at a public meeting addressed by ES Reddy in Dublin on the 19th of March, 1985, and this, I quote Sean McBride. It has been my privilege to work with ES Reddy for close on 20 years. And I can say, without fear of contradiction, that there is no one in the United Nations who has done more to expose the injustices of apartheid and the illegality of the South African regime than as ES Reddy. And he has done so with tremendous courage and ability. He dedicated his entire energy and skills to the liberation from oppression of the people of Southern Africa. He had to face many obstacles and antagonisms coming from the Western powers mainly, but he had the skill, he had the courage and determination necessary to overcome the systemic, overt and covert opposition to the liberation of the people of South Africa. And thank you, ES, for that remarkable time that you spent at the United Nations. And I think the entire population of this country remain eternally grateful for the work that you had done there. May I turn to you now, ES, and then just put a couple of questions to you. You left the USA, you left for the USA in 1943 at the very tender age of 19. It was at a time, remember colleagues, in 1943, the World War II was intensely raging in Europe. And this was a period when Nehru, I believe, was still in prison. Negotiations were underway for the independence of India from British colonialism. What was it like for you, ES, at that time in Andhra Pradesh and India? And what made you leave your country at that very tender age, head for New York, and then the United Nations?
Well, I was politically conscious, and I admired Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, and I was already interested in South Africa.
You may have to turn up your volume in your computers. Carry on, yes.
I was already interested in South Africa and the struggle for liberation. Gandhi has written about it. He has suffered from it. And Nehru did what he could to fight it. So I was committed to support the liberation struggle. So I went to New York for further studies in 1943, and shortly after, in 1946, there was the Indian passive resistance in South Africa. I was very much interested to get news about the passive resistance. I used to go to the library of the Council on African Affairs, headed by Paul Robeson, and read the newspapers they had. They had the Bantu World, and they had another paper, communist paper, weekly, and I used to get the news from them. So I was very well informed. And in 1948, I was an intern in the UN. In 1949, I was given a job in the United Nations as a political affairs officer. And part of my job was research on South Africa. So I continued my research on South Africa. And The United Nations itself got involved in the struggle in South Africa in later years, by 1960. And the United Nations had branches all over the world, offices all over the world. So with my dedication, I was able to use the resources of the United Nations to help the struggle in South Africa. First of all, to get the struggle known, get the situation known, get the leaders known, and secondly, to promote action against apartheid and the apartheid government, especially sanctions against that government. So when we talk about my contribution, it is a contribution to the official of this big organization. If you have any more questions?
All right, thank you. Yes, let me put another matter to you. When you started in the early 1960-63 at the United Nations, fighting for our cause, there was very little support there, particularly from the Western nations. And yet by the 1980s, you had mobilized probably the entire world who was sympathetic, to our struggle, and they were able to impose military, economic, and every other sanction we can think of. And South Africa became a pariah nation across the world. Take us a little bit through that evolution of that, change went from very little support, and in fact, the entire world, supporting the struggle. How did that happen? Give us a sense of that.
1960-63, yes, when the United Nations passed resolutions against apartheid. At that time, earlier there were very few non-white nations, non-European nations in the United Nations. But after that time, after 1960, African Asian countries became independent and joined the United Nations, and they had a big majority. So they could get any resolution passed. And they got resolutions passed against apartheid, or action against apartheid. So that gave me an opportunity to do my best to have those things implemented.
Thank you. I just have one further short question. There are many countries that, that supported South Africa at the United Nations, but that one country for me stood out, and that was Sweden. As you know, in Sweden, led by Olof Palme, supported South Africa more than probably any other country. And there are reports that, Olof Palme was assassinated by South African agents, and that, controversy still rages. Tell us a little bit, about your experience with Sweden and Olof Palme, who I'm sure you met.
Sweden is an interesting example. In 1946, Sweden voted with South Africa. When India tried to bring a complaint to the United Nations, South Africa claimed that it was within their domestic jurisdiction, and the United Nations was not competent to do so. And Sweden voted with South Africa. But Swedish public opinion changed, and later Sweden became one of the strongest supporters of the liberation movement. It gave millions of dollars to the African National Congress to publicize their struggle and use it for all non-military aspects of the struggle. That shows the evolution of public opinion and its impact on the governments. Olof Palme, in particular, was very much involved in this. Actually, he was the one who pressed for direct grants to the liberation movement. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, ES. Zandile, I want to welcome you. Can you hear me? Zandile, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you so much, and my apologies for coming on late.
No, delighted to have you. For any other reason, always a pleasure to have another Reddy on the panel.
I'm here with my mom.
Oh, good. All right,
Hello,
we'll turn to
hello
you.
everybody.
Hello, welcome as well,
Hello,
and we'll turn
hello,
to you a
hello.
little
Thank
later.
you.
Let me
All
turn
right.
now to our first panelist, and Dr. Mongane Wally Serote is with us. Just to tell you, he was awarded the Order of Ikhamanga by the South African government. He's a poet laureate, a novelist, a political activist, and went into exile. And he was a former member of the parliament. And Wally, we very much, looking forward to hearing you about your experiences with ES and with the United Nations and your time abroad. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I thought I should share a poem with all of us, but dedicated to ES, a poem, an epic poem which I had written, dedicating it to ES's friend, Oliver Reginald Tambo. It starts as OR, you will walk as should Madiba, as did the many, many women who marched to Pretoria, Dora Tamana. You will walk, as did Sisulu and Khesha and Lambete, as did Rahima Musa, as we often wonder about those who fell. They walked the young. So many of them who flocked to fly, visible like migrating flamingos. The flamingos migrating from poverty and the cruelty of oppression to seek freedom. The young took the bullet in the streets and alleys and footpaths, in game reserves and in villages, in towns and in houses which had become battlefields, where their lives were abruptly torn apart as they walked into a fierce fight against the enemy, and rather than be captured, fought to the last drop of blood. How did all this sit in you, OOR? Did it happen? Did you ask in the quiet moments of your being, why? Why me? OR, why you? Did you? Did you utter those words? It never ever showed if you did. When the time comes, OR, we will hear what you and Bram Fisher talk about, what you and Yusuf Dadu discuss, and what you and Red September, with his rare humor and quietness, and Ray and Jack Simon talk about. And when Madiba asks Shaka, this with his husky voice and guttural laughter, how are you? All of you will break into a staccato of happy laughter. We know so because you will be celebrating comradeship, which civilization has prized as the high bar of human blood, the cost of your peace and freedom, which you all cherished. You will be amused by what you all left behind here, us, who flail in space and time, embracing the wisdom you left for us, flesh and blood, brain and spirit, still struggling, and in struggle to make sense of it all for all of us, about this, a different time. OR, where those who thought were our own have turned against us, the twilight or the dawn, now all whisper in the distance, and we whisper to you, for then there is a rapture coming. There is a revolution coming, and we miss you. We miss you and your companions. We miss you all, you and your comrades. Oh, beloved OR, you and the many friends you walked and strode the world with, those whose hands you held with warmth and love, as you exchanged what embraced your hearts. At times in whispers, you spoke, you the architects of the revolution, you and your friends all over the world at the United Nations, you looked each other in the eye as if not to forget how each of you looked like. As with a gentle embrace and shaking of hands, you bade each other farewell. For in those days, the days were filled with colors and shades of change, mauve, yellow, red, blue, or purple. We try to imagine you living in this time as it promises to be dawn once more. May you be in communion with hundreds and millions and billions of freedom fighters and give us that wisdom and spirit, generations upon generations of the earth's freedom fighters. We hope you will then remember, we are here, we beseech you, we are here to search with the only thing we have, our lives, for peace in the fourth revolution. OR, you and your peers, life can be threatening for us if we are not careful. But remember, do ancestors have memory, may I ask? You will then remember that we mean it when we remember you and think about you and those you broke bread with as we meet them. When we pondered over freedom and peace, thinking about you also, which you spoke about looking us with a firm gaze. Thus we will enter from the first to the fourth revolution. It stares us in the eye at this moment, this revolution, registering its presence. OR and you and your peers, wherever you are, as ancestors and even here on earth, it is also here. The fourth revolution is here. We remember you and we seek your wisdom. Stand as you used to be when you spoke to us about the future and the times we must live. You said, it is only the ANC which can destroy itself. That's what you said. What do we do when we leave that threatening moment now, OOR? The moment seeks to hold us by our scruff. We nourish the spirit through which the mind and body are kept intact and in harmony. You, all of you, OR, and the comrades and beloved friends and brothers with whom you walk the streets and the highways of the world, speaking to us about freedom, speaking to the world about freedom. Here we are again, beginning from where you left. I dedicate this to ES. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wally, for that moving poem. I think we'd all like to see that published in some way. But having said that, would you like to speak to ES? You want to ask him some question, make any remarks?
Yes, only a few things. ES, I read more about you and heard more about you in different meetings. And I just wanted to, I read this poem to try and jolt your mind about OR. Is it possible for you to share with us your moments with OR? Thank you very much.
I'm glad, and in fact, we're proud that you have dedicated your poem about OR to me. Oliver Tambo was a very dear friend of mine from the time he came out of South Africa around 1960 till he passed away in South Africa in 1983. Thank you very much. He was a great man. He was a great statesman who looked far beyond. He was a tactician and a strategist of a struggle which was protracted. I'm very proud to have him as a friend.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for that. Thank you.
All right. Have you anything further, Wally?
No, thank you very much. I thought I should just share.
Thank you again for that very moving poem. And I'm sure we're all dying to be reading it at some point, which we'll get from you. Can we turn to our second panelist, and that is Ila Gandhi, who is a peace activist and a struggle hero from this country's freedom struggle political activist, a former member of parliament, and present chair of the Gandhi Development Trust. Ila, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing this webinar in recognition of the important work that Comrade ES has been doing. I don't know if people know here, but Comrade ES, I and my cousin Gopal Krishna Gandhi, we are like brothers and sisters. And so Comrade ES is our eldest brother in the family. And I know that you're going to be celebrating your 96th or 69th birthday, shall we say, in a few days' time, 1st of July. Am I right, Comrade ES? So I just want to say that, I know that you have written many, many books on Gandhiji. Too many books to actually talk about, but it gives a vast testimony of the knowledge that Comrade ES had about Gandhiji's work and Gandhiji's life, apart from what he has done for South Africa as well. At an early age, he was introduced into the resistance struggle when his father participated in the Defiance campaign in India in 1940-41. I think Jairam already spoke about that. At that time, you were just a teenager, and going forward, you went to America, where you studied further and then took on this position at the United Nations. And you worked there for the rest of your life, I believe. Here, your work was dedicated to the South African freedom struggle. And you worked with both the Indian delegates at the UN, who were very supportive of the South African struggle, and with our leaders from South Africa, like Comrade Tambo. But before him, you also worked, I believe, very closely with Dr. Nguma, whom you met right at the beginning, when they came with the delegation in 1946 with Dr. Naidoo and a few other people to talk about the South African struggle. So taking your cue from this, I believe that you also organized a student demonstration in front of the South African consulate in New York at that time. So you weren't just working at the UN, but you were also an activist in your own right. And you also helped the freedom, movement, I believe, to organize the anti-apartheid movement all around the world through, giving them some leads to different people at the different universities and so on. This is what I've heard from a lot of people, and I read about your story. This is what I understood. You can correct me later if I've made a mistake, but I believe that that was your involvement, absolute involvement with assisting the South African struggle. I also heard that you personally met many South African delegates who came to America or to the United Nations in order to, move various resolutions and so on. And you were able, through your position, to give them access to things that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. So it was a great contribution, and we thank you tremendously for that work. But I also remember the first time I met you when you came to the conference at UDW. I think the so-called UDW, where Jairam Reddy was vice chancellor at the time, and I think Mike Sutcliffe was the PRO at the time. I'm not sure what they called him, but I believe something like that, his position at the university. And I remember that you, Father Huddleston, and Comrade Minty were quite devastated that nothing was actually done to remember and to commemorate the memories of Gandhiji and Chief Albert Luthuli. And you raised this with Comrade Jairam and with Mike Sutcliffe, as a result of which the Gandhi Luthuli Peace Institute started at the university in 1991. So I remember that time when you came there and you raised these issues. And since then, a lot of work has been done. I think you had the opportunity to see Phoenix Settlement developed, and it is still developing. There are, at the moment, it's going to be declared a national heritage site, and hopefully in a year or two, it will be declared a World Heritage Site. You'd be pleased to know that, Comrade ES, that these are some of the things that have happened over here. I also want to thank you sincerely for all the assistance you have given over the years to both remembering Gandhiji's memory, keeping alive the movement, and the philosophy, not just through your own lifestyle, because I know that, despite the fact that you had quite a senior position in the United Nations, but you always lived a humble lifestyle. And I think most of your money was spent on books and not personal items, and on the struggle. So I think that, your life and your work is or should be an inspiration for the young people today. And I hope that this webinar is going to reach across to many young people to understand what it is to be a good leader, to understand what it is to have commitment to a cause, and that when you begin to work, it's not necessary to work because you want to have upward mobility, achieve positions, get a lot of money, but rather to achieve your ideals. And this is what I think that you have demonstrated through your life. And I really appreciate that. And I hope that the young people today will begin to look at that way of life. Just finally, I want to say that this present pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has got the whole world to think in new ways. And we can go the way that the world has gone previously when they've had pandemics, when they've had wars, when they had Hiroshima. Instead of building peace and a good society, they opted to have more military, have bigger weapons, more powerful weapons. and fill the world with nuclear weapons. I hope that this time, with this pandemic, the world would change and learn a lesson that you and your colleagues have taught us, people like Comrade O.R., Comrade Wally Serote, and others who are teaching us that there is more to life than materialism, that there is more to life than war. You can achieve things through peaceful means. So thank you very much for that, Comrade ES. And perhaps you would want to speak more about that. And I wish you all the best on your birthday, 1st of July. I'll remember that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hila. Is there anything that you want to put to ES?
Well, just that, you know, you have gone through at the UN and you've had your ups and downs. I believe that often because of your work with the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement, you did suffer, you know, in your position at the UN. How did you balance the two? Your commitment to the freedom struggle and your work at the UN.
Did you hear the question? Yes.
Yes. Well, I did contribute to the struggle against apartheid all over the world because I was in a crucial position at the United Nations and I could use the resources of the United Nations, the offices of the United Nations, to spread the struggle all over the world. The struggle would have won anyway, because righteous struggles always succeed. But my work did speed up and did make it possible to win the struggle without any violence. Thank you.
Anything further, Hila?
I think that's it.
All right. Thank you, Hila, very much for reminding us for those important sequence of events in ES's life, so relevant to our work in this country. Can I turn to the next speaker, Sam Ramsamy? He also is the Order of Ikhamanga, and he's the anti-apartheid activist and former member of the executive of the International Olympic Committee. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jairam. Now, of course, I never called him ES or Enuga. I always called him Mr. Reddy. Mr. Reddy, it's wonderful to see you here, and especially that you are still looking, although 95, you're looking very, very well. And we have very many incidents that we could recollect, but that will probably go on for, if I have to enumerate all, it will probably take days and days to come in. But first, I'd like to convey to you the regards of my wife, Helga, whom you know very, very well. And of course, we had wonderful activities together in New York when you were my boss at the United Nations. In fact, as you know, our relationship goes on for nearly 50 years. And luckily, although I shouldn't say luckily, I was in exile. And of course, that made it much easier for me to communicate with you, both via telephonic link and physical link. And that, I think, was wonderful. I have a different type of a dimension that Wally and Ella talked about earlier, simply because we had a close personal attachment for many, many years. And of course, it's difficult for me to even start. Where do I start? I've listed a few points, and I'll try to jog your memory, Mr. Reddy, to see. As I said, both Helga and I always called you Mr. Reddy. Anand Singh also passes on his regards to you. I know you still keep in touch with him, and he's asked me to convey regards to you. Now, I remember, when you first employed me as a consultant, of course, the first thing I had to learn was how to draft documents for the United Nations. And of course, they had a specific formula and a method regarding the format and layout of the documents, when to put a full stop, when to highlight issues, when to highlight uppercase, when to highlight the lowercase. And of course, you gave me a listen, of course. You sent me to one of the United Nations Secretariat members then. And of course, you wouldn't believe it, I still use that particular format now in any document that I do. So that again is a type of a legacy that will remain with me and with you for many, many years, Mr. Reddy. Now, of course, again, I was fortunate to observe when you were involved in painstaking efforts to ensure that the resolutions prepared by the United Nations for the United Nations General Assembly always had majority support. You never failed in that. And of course, most importantly, you had to ensure broad support, because we had, of course, the support of India, we had the support of many African countries, especially directed from Tanzania and Nigeria. Of course, Nigerians played a very important role because through your efforts, many Nigerians became chairs of the Special Committee Against Apartheid, especially like Edwin Egbu, Avril Harriman, Joe Garba, and Maitama Sule, and all remembered you very, very well for your activity work. And they said they never had such an easy time chairing other committees because all the work was done by Enuga Reddy. Of course, only afterwards I got to know that your name was Enuga Reddy, because I always knew your initials ES Reddy, never as Enuga. But afterwards I got to know about Enuga. And you had to make sure that you had broad support of the resolutions you presented. And of course, it was not easy. You had the Soviet Union on one end, who at that stage, part of the East European bloc, and there were very many issues there within the United Nations. And then you had highly respected countries like already Jairam talked about Sweden and other Nordic countries and Canada. And you did a superb job in cementing and being a cohesive type of an agreement where we had general support for United Nations General Assembly resolution. That I will never forget, because I worked with you. And of course, I'm going to tell you something else later, how this all happened. And of course, you arranged for me to have a 2-3 month consultancy term with the United Nations. And of course, that means working for you when you were still director of the Center Against Apartheid. And of course, we traveled to many parts of the world with you, to various parts where we engaged with governments, we engaged with activists, we engaged with individuals, and you always gave me a speaking opportunity. We visited India, we visited the Philippines, we went to New York on very many occasions. And I remember on one occasion, you arranged for Gough Whitlam, the former president former Prime Minister of Australia, to chair one of our sessions. And that all happened because of you. And of course, although the sports boycott came in rather late compared to everything else, but you did an exceptional job in getting the resolution against South Africa on very many fronts, including crime against humanity. And all of that worked very, very well. And of course, then between you and me, we started what was called the United Nations Sports Register. Of course, that was initiated by you, but you gave me the opportunity to formulate the activities. And although it was generally referred in the United Nations as the United Nations Sports Register of Contacts with South Africa, where we highlighted individuals, clubs, and countries that collaborated with apartheid South Africa. But in most parts of the world, that became known as the blacklist. And there we highlighted very many individuals who were named and shamed. And that, again, I think is a great, great honor for you, Mr. Reddy, in what you did in doing this. I remember, of course, Helga and I, we used to skim through various documentations, various publications, various news items to try and get all these collaborators with apartheid. And especially the Western media press were looking forward to this annual publication of the register, and it received wide type of a support from all over the world. And that, I think, again, highlighted what was happening in the activities by the United Nations against apartheid. And most importantly, you know, we got countries, of course, Africa was not a problem because anyone who collaborated with apartheid, they were not allowed to enter any of the African states. But then we got the Nordic countries to do this, again, being led by Sweden, which was followed by Finland, followed by Denmark and Norway. That helped us tremendously in what you did. And this, again, is something that, of course, goes against the records of the apartheid collaborators, but again, it highlighted the type of activities you were involved in with the Mr. Reddy. Of course, Helga going into a different mode altogether now. And I remember, of course, when I worked at the United Nations, I always worked till late, and Helga joined me. And then, of course, when you finished work, you always came into my office and said, "What are you doing now?" And of course, Helga was always delighted. You'll take us to wonderful restaurants all over the world, all over of course, not initially around the UN, but afterwards all over New York. We got to know all the best restaurants, especially the Indian restaurants. And of course, Helga will not forget that you gave us an education about Indian cuisine. And we went to one restaurant, I remember, you said, let's start with what's for breakfast. Then we had lunch, and then we had dinner all through one particular evening. And these are incidents that highlighted whatever we're doing, because not only did you have this intense period of activity that you concentrated so much when you were locked up in your office, which of course smelt of cigarettes all the time. I don't know, I don't think you smoke anymore now, because I've never seen you at your office without a cigarette in your hand. And
Sam, if I may intervene, time is going. If you wouldn't mind bringing it to a conclusion, please, because we've got a number of panelists to fit in the time.
Lastly, many of us were very sad that you were not able to attend the inauguration of Nelson Mandela as the first non-racial president of South Africa. In fact, I was then on the committee of the inauguration grouping with people like Bishop Tutu and the others, and we made sure that you were a special guest. Apparently, that invitation never got to you, but I am glad that in the end, the Order of Or Tambo, a companion of Or Tambo, was dedicated to you. And sadly, again, you were in New York then, you couldn't go, and we spoke at that time. You were not able to travel to Washington because Washington was the headquarters for the South African embassy, but I think you sent your daughter to receive it. We cannot in any way forget all these incidents, Mr. Reddy. Thanks a lot for everything you've done, and your name will be indelibly recorded in the history of the struggle against apartheid.
Thank you very much, Sam. If we may turn to Uma Dhupelia-Mesthrie, who is an she's a professor of history at UWC and author of several books, including the biography of Manilal Gandhi and that very popular book, Cane Fields to Freedom, a Chronicle of Indian Life. Uma, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, Mr. Reddy. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel and to speak after such our elders. I know Ila Gandhi's mentioned the 1st of July as ES Reddy's birthday, but she herself will be turning 80. And so it's actually, I speak here as one of the younger people that Mr. Reddy has actually helped as a historian. Mr. Reddy met me at Yale University in 1989, where I was very green and had hardly begun to start writing seriously. And since then, I've been in touch with him for many, many years, and he has provided extraordinary help to anybody writing about anything. If you write to Mr. Reddy, comes articles, and in one case he says, "I'm your proofreader this time," and you check every little thing and correct things. So what I wanted to do today was to pay tribute to Mr. Reddy, not as the activist and his job at the UN, but the amazing career that he had as a historian after leaving the United Nations. And it is important to recognize the breadth of his work, because he's not just written about Gandhi. He has not just written about Indians. He's written about the anti-apartheid movement. He's written about Tambo. And so if you are working on South African history, at some stage you will have to consult some of the works of ES Reddy. And what I found quite phenomenal is that not only he didn't confine himself to any particular century. So he has written about things from the 18th century right up to the 20th century. And if you're a historian, you must know that is a phenomenal feat. We always say we are 19th century historians or 20th century historians, but he's done across the breadth of several centuries. His history writing falls in particular genres. I think biography has been extremely important to Mr. Reddy. If you take the work of Yusuf Dadoo, when he put that collection together, it was to highlight the biography of Yusuf Dadoo through his writings. And he did the same thing for Gandhi. He did the same thing for Oliver Tambo. And I think a second aspect of his writing is that inter-race relationships were quite important. So that is why he spent a lot of time writing about the white women who supported Gandhi, the Shriners and the Emily Hobhouse and so forth. So that is another aspect to show relationships across the races. But a lot of his work is about collecting documents and putting together documentary collections so that these then become source books for other historians to use. And I think that's also important. But I don't know if people know, but Mr. Reddy once sent me something that he wrote for his grandchildren. And it's called When Grandpa Was Young. And I think this is the most extraordinary history book for his young grandchildren. And I hope, Mr. Reddy, you will publish this so that the children of the world will read this, not just your grandchildren. I was looking at it, and in it, he explains to his children what apartheid was, to his grandchildren, and what he did to fight apartheid and why he did that. I think all children should actually read that. And so you're also a historian for young children. But in addition to the writing of history, I think what he's done is quite extraordinary. If you look at the archives around the world, you will find an ES Reddy collection. These exist at Yale University, the Nehru Memorial Library, the University of Witwatersrand, the Gandhi Luthuli Center, UCT manuscript collection, South African history online, the ANC website, all put together by one man. It is just absolutely phenomenal to have put together documentary collections like this to build an archive so that other people can then draw on it, not just for you to develop yourself as a professional or to write books and gain glory, but for the use of generations who will come. Now, I thought I wanted to just say something about the early history of slaves that you wrote. That was quite an incredible feat. We have wonderful slave historians in South Africa who have built a reputation in writing about Dutch slavery and English slavery through the period. But what Mr. Reddy did was to analyze the number of Indian slaves in South Africa that had not a little told story. That's what he said. And when I was doing my book From Cane Fields to Freedom, I came across this document at UCT written by ES Reddy, and I realized I could not start the story of Indians in South Africa with indentured labor, and that I had to start it with a story of the slaves. And that's where I found the story that from Mr. Reddy's work of a young Ari who was kidnapped from Surat in the 17th century and came to Cape Town. But that is just one example of what Mr. Reddy has done. When I was working on my book on Manilal Gandhi, I wrote to Mr. Reddy and said, this is what I'm working. Within minutes came indexes to archives in India, the Gandhi archives at Sabarmati, every single letter that Manilal might have written or people wrote to him, and it was invaluable help to me. But I also want to say that Mr. Reddy's written an absolutely fascinating story about the Pyarelal papers, and it shows his own detective work and his own commitment to make archives accessible and not to be closed down and embargoed. And it is a fascinating story about how he discovered that Gandhi's secretary, Pyarelal, kept to himself a whole lot of documents instead of giving it to the collected works of Gandhi, the collected works conglomerate. And Mr. Reddy then worked to locate these documents, to free them from that embargo. It took, I think, more than a decade or more, maybe probably 2 decades before they were made available to, but it is detective work and pursuit by speaking to the right ministers to make sure that was gone. So I think what I wanted to just pose a question to Mr. Reddy to ask you, where does this passion come? I mean, I also want to know where you get this phenomenal energy to do all this kind of work. But where does your passion for history come? And what is the link between the politics of writing, the politics and history for you, if that's a possible question? And how did you come to get involved in writing about the slaves?
Yeah. Well, I love research. So I was doing research, a lot of research, when I retired, and I had the time to do research. And I had a long life. I had seen South Africa changing, different phases of South Africa, and different phases of the struggle in South Africa. So I was lucky to know that. So I thought I should make it available for other people who are interested in the subject, who may be much younger, may be born later. But while I was doing the research, I found, to my surprise, that Indian slaves were taken to South Africa, or rather Indians were taken to South Africa into slavery. So that fascinated me, and I started doing research on Indian slaves in South Africa. I'm glad that that research was useful for you in preparing your book on the history of the Indian city. Thank you.
Anything else, Uma?
Are you going to publish your grandpa's stories when grandpa was young?
I wrote it for my grandchildren when they were very young. And I've been thinking of supplementing it, bringing it more up to date, and to become almost an autobiography of myself. But I never got to do it. I don't know, I will try, but I don't know if I'll succeed.
Is that it, Uma?
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Uma, very much for bringing forth those interesting dimensions about his life, particularly the scholarly dimension and the generosity of his documentation, which he has bequeathed to so many scholarly places in the world. Can we turn now to the next panelist, Naidoo, who is a political analyst, member of the advisory board of the Gandhi Luthuli Documentation Center, and latterly author of a popular book, Made in Chatsworth. Kiru, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy, and greetings, Mr. Reddy, order of the companions of Oliver Tambo. It's just chilling for us to link the two of your names together, because we hold Oliver Tambo in such high esteem, and to see that those two names linked to you, and also just feel very privileged to be in eminent company, and want to also pay tribute to all of you for both your activist and scholarly work. As Uma pointed out, a tremendous amount of the work we do today uses you as a reference. I think that probably upwards of 50–60% of everything we do, we're bound to consult something that you've written. So not only have you been an unrelenting activist for freedom, not just in South Africa, but around the world, but your role as a documentalist and archivist must be one of the finest records of the South African struggle for freedom. But I want to add a rejoinder to what others have said, in that you were not concentrated on the South African struggle. And I think that if we see more broadly, it was the Southern African struggle. And you're held in great esteem, whether it's Mozambique or Namibia or Zimbabwe. Your name is still recorded there as somebody who, in having kept the documents and archived such important and precious parts of our collective history, that's something that would have been lost had it not been for your work. And we must constantly pay tribute to that, and it's a formidable legacy that your work is in so many archives around the world, and of course right here in this city, the papers that you've bequeathed to us. Sam just now, and I want to recognize him, he's my homeboy from the magazine Barracks, so we're pleased to be part of this session with you. He was talking about the invitation being lost to the 1994 inauguration. I, of course, in our last encounter, lost you in the airport, but I'm glad after that I was able to retrieve you after some time. I want to just use these few minutes we have just to talk to maybe 4 brief points, and I'll put it together collectively, mindful of our time. And I want to pinpoint those subjects which I think are lacking in the literature, but these are all items in which you had a direct hand. And I want to take you through 4 of those. The first was something that Ila started out with 1946, and the visit to New York of the president of the ANC, Dr. Nkrumah, and you had a very keen hand in organizing meetings for him, giving him access to various people. And in the writing of the history of the ANC for 100 years, that was one aspect I think that ought to have got greater attention, because it was one of the first instances where Black South African leaders were able to access an international audience, and you were key to that. The second reference that I want you to tell us a bit, or give us some insight on, is the 1960 Nobel Peace Prize to Chief Luthuli. And this year we celebrate 60 years of that Peace Prize. But there must have been some behind-the-scenes work from your committee, from the level of the anti-apartheid movement, to get that prize accorded to Chief Luthuli. And I wonder if you could just share some of that with us. The next one is 1963, and the speech by Miriam Makeba at the United Nations, and that very powerful appeal that she made to the leaders of the world not to be silent in the face of South African oppression. And arising from that, we saw in the course of that decade, Nelson Mandela's name coming up in great prominence, largely because of her and others' activist work. And as that followed into the 70s with Comrade Serote and others. But that was, in my view, an iconic speech at the United Nations, a young woman standing up to be the voice of her people. And I'd like you to maybe reflect on what kind of impact that particular speech had. And the fourth thing is to do with sports and the role of Papua Sugalan and the extent to which his victory in the Dutch Open, the oppression and obstacles that Papua Sugalan faced in South Africa and the curbs on his travel and so on, whether that had any kind of resonance at the United Nations and whether there was any particular symbolism attached to his tremendous victories at that time when Gary Player was getting all of the attention in the United States. But there was a local champion, a black golfer, who was taking on the world. And I want to just try and link that with the broader issues that you were campaigning around at the United Nations and at the global level of isolating the apartheid regime. Thank you very much for joining us on this panel. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, have you got those issues that Kiro has raised?
Yes, I had a lot of papers in the United Nations during my work. Papers we got from all over the world, and papers produced by the United Nations. And I had them all in my office. I was not the kind of person who threw any papers. So when I retired, I collected all the papers, sorted them out, and made them available for the researchers on the Facebook and other channels. So I think that is a service I did. I'm glad that has been useful and appreciated. Thank you.
Kiro, okay?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Please proceed.
All right, is there anything more, Kiro? Can we move on?
Yes, I suggest we move on. We can always return to some of these questions if we have time.
Okay, thank you, Kiro. I think before we get to our final speaker, Kalpana Hiralal, I believe Advocate Zandile Nkono Reddy, I want to welcome her. She's the chairperson of the advisory board of the Gandhi Luthuli Documentation Center. She's also the niece of the late struggle veteran Phyllis Naidoo and daughter of ANC exiles Ahmed Aki Elijah Nkono and Dr. Cynthia Nkono. We are blessed that Dr. Cynthia Nkono joins Zandile as part of this session. And over to you, Zandile. I believe you had one or two questions for ES.
Thank you, Chair. Not questions, just a few comments, which I would come to in a bit. First of all, let me just say that I'm really privileged to be with all of you today. And thank you to the organizers for having us come on board. So I was asked to talk about my dad. To talk about my dad and as a child of exile. So my dad was the chief rep to the ANC in West Africa. and he was stationed in Dakar. And that's where I was born in 1983. My father's work was confined, I think, to West Africa and Africa as a whole. But our family's ties with India comes from, or was cemented through another family member who is my mom's first husband, Eric Singh, and my sister's father, who had gone into exile, and he had received the assistance of India, who were gracious to give him and some of the other comrades' passports. The irony of today's conversation and being asked to participate in the conversation is actually from a discussion that my mother and I had early in the lockdown, where she had given me a few of her papers that she had used for some of her political science students. And one of them was a document, if I can just show that to you, it's here, with my Aunt Phyllis's writing on the top in manuscript. And she says, more state actors in the struggle against apartheid. And what we have here is a document prepared by Dr. ES Reddy, and there's a preface by Mr. Joseph N. Garba from Nigeria, who was the chairman of the Special Committee Against Apartheid. I thought it would be appropriate just to share some of read some of the extracts from this document. And this document was prepared in 1985. So the first excerpt goes as follows. The bond between the national movements of India and South Africa became stronger during the Second World War. The Indians in South Africa were no longer recent immigrants, but were born in South Africa and developed deep roots in that country. With the encouragement of the Indian national movement, they recognized that their destiny was linked to that of the African majority and increasingly participated in joint struggles against racist measures. The militants from Gandhians to Marxists, under the leadership of Dr. Yusuf Dadoo and Dr. Monty Naika, took over leadership of the community from the so-called moderates who were compromising with the racist regime, and entered into a pact with the African National Congress of South Africa. Close quote. India joined the African states in calling for security discussion of apartheid after the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. It co-sponsored the General Assembly Resolution of 1962, urging all states to impose sanctions against South Africa and establishing the Special Committee Against Apartheid. There are further quotes here where Dr. ES has quoted Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, as well as Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, whose comments were made for the support of the anti-apartheid struggle in about 1985 and 1982. And the last one that I would leave you with is India, a poor country, gave up over 5% of its export trade in 1946 to demonstrate its repugnance of racism in South Africa. Why is it that the major trading partners of South Africa are unwilling to give up even 1% or less of their trade? Are they less committed to the struggle against racism? So That, Dr. ES, is just something that I wanted to contribute. Auntie Ela had previously said, and she had called upon young people to follow in your steps, and which I have heeded to. I've listened to Auntie Ela's call as my elder. Thank you, Dr. ES, for your invaluable contribution towards the struggles of South Africans and South Africans in particular, and humanity. Yes, so thank you.
Zandile, thank you very much for bringing that new dimension to our conversation. And I'm sure it has jogged ES's memory about those many things that you mentioned. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Let us turn now finally to Kalpana Hiralal, who is a professor of history at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And importantly, she is the author, co-author of Pioneers of Satyagraha, together with, ES Reddy. And they took a long time, I believe, several years to write this together, and they worked very closely together. And Kalpana, we are looking forward to hearing not only of that experience, but to give us an overview and bring this workshop to a conclusion. We have lost the audio from Kalpana.
Thank you,
Selvan?
Professor Reddy. Okay, good evening.
I can hear you now.
Okay, good evening, and thank you, Professor Reddy, and good evening, Dr. Reddy, and wonderful to see you after so many years of email contact. Tonight, I just want to recollect my experiences working with Dr. Reddy.
Selvan, we're having some audio problems with Kalpana.
Regrettably, her link is not too good. So let's just give it a little bit of time and hopefully she is able to catch on. It's a poor line on her part, on her end rather. I apologize for the technical glitch.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah, that's better, Kalpana.
Okay, so Mr. Reddy was very helpful, and we kept into correspondence around, say, 2005, when Dr. Reddy wrote to me, stating, "Dear Kalpana, are you interested in working on a who's who of Indian women who went to jail or were persecuted?" Oh, it was an area of my research that I was already working on. So the research did not commence immediately, as heavy teaching commitments and my relocation from the former University of Durban Westville to Howard College was very, very time consuming. However, I began the research in earnest around 2008, 2009, and I made contact with Dr. Reddy, and he was excited about the project. And if I remember correctly, he was not sure at the time if he could spend time on that project due to health reasons, but he encouraged me to pursue it, guiding me in terms of the structure of the book, the information, the sources, and he encouraged me also to document less marginalized women, in particular those whose narratives and stories were often kind of unknown and overlooked. So together with Dr. Reddy's help, I tried to locate as many women as possible of Indian origin in the liberation struggle. Dr. Reddy kindly emailed me, with biographies he had collected and collated over the years. We must have exchanged well over 100 emails. And I actually created a file which I titled ES Correspondence. So, Dr. Reddy, I'm truly grateful for your painstaking assistance and advice, and I was later successful in compiling 62 biographical profiles of South African women of Indian origin who contributed to the freedom struggle in South Africa. But we worked very closely. We co-authored a book titled Pioneers of Satyagraha, Indian South Africans Defy Racist Laws in 1907. And we would find that the book actually took a long time actually to be drafted and to be written, etc. And we found, and with the book itself, it had two parts to it. Part one was the Satyagraha campaigns, and part two was really a list of Satyagrahis, list that Enuga himself had actually compiled. And what made it very, very easy for me to actually work particularly on this book was simply because the volume of information that Enuga had was just priceless. I mean, as a historian, it was a goldmine to me. Enuga, Dr. Reddy had over the years built a rich and a very priceless archives, repository of information that consisted of biographies, interviews, speeches, clippings from rare news, lectures, eminences, camps, and of course, a very rich collection of photographs. And this information allows us to, as most writings when examining the campaign, tended to focus on Gandhi. So this shift was to highlight the contributions of the community and Satyagraha, etc. Now, because there was not much information on the Satyagrahis themselves, because very few of them were mentioned in Gandhi's book Satyagraha in South Africa, but the vast majority were unknown and forgotten. And he really wanted to dedicate this book to them. So our book allowed the Satyagraha narratives to be told from a very different perspective, and that of the masses, that is the resistors. And this book has a very important legacy for the descendants of their Satyagrahis. Enuga had received several messages over the years from families requesting information if their ancestors were with Gandhi or participated, or even for more information. So the book really provides valuable information on hundreds of resistors. And we hope that further research and contributions of descendants of the Satyagrahis will add really to the histories of the Satyagraha campaign and the wider struggles in South Africa. And in part two of the book, we present biographical portraits of some of the resistors, as well as a list, as I mentioned earlier, of resistors or Satyagrahis. Though not complete, it does cover, who participated. And most of the names were unknown. The list identifies individuals, their occupation status, years of imprisonment, and it goes on, and it even points to the sources. And what is very interesting and impressive was that this list was entirely the work of Enuga. He painstakingly, compiled this list, perusing over, Indian opinion, collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, several sources, and it is a truly impressive list. And it actually occupies over 50, approximately 70 pages of the book itself. And so by the time this book was complete, it was the first comprehensive and detailed book on the history of the Satyagraha camp. Dr. Reddy wrote to me stating, and I quote, "I'm glad you agreed to collaborate with me on this book. I'm not an easy person to work with, but this book is coming out very well as a major contribution." Close quote. But for me, working with Enuga was truly an honor. It was my first collaborative experience, a project, and to have worked with someone who was so resourceful, informative, insightful on the Indian struggle in South Africa was very rewarding. He was very well connected. To aid my research, he provided contact details, photographs, emails, telephone numbers of people who I could contact. And he would constantly send me historical information, or if he remembered something or found something. He once wrote, and I quote, "I hope these emails are not annoying, but helpful." They were certainly very helpful. So the information that Dr. Reddy shared with me and the context he provided over the years enabled me to develop my own historical archives, for which I will always be grateful to Dr. Reddy. Another aspect that I want to also highlight is that Dr. Reddy was always willing to share his archives and knowledge. People were always writing to him, asking him for information if they were tracing family histories. When I was struggling to find information on Mrs. Bai Fatima Sheikh Mehtab, one of the first Muslim women to participate in the 1913 Satyagraha campaign, he alerted me to the Gujarati section of Indian Opinion, which had a letter written by Mrs. Sheikh outlining her reasons, for participation. And this was so valuable information because there was practically no written accounts, particularly in terms of the reasons and for women's participation in the context of the Cell judgment. And one of the qualities I admired about Dr. Reddy was he was very meticulous, compiling information. He documented information on events, people, even if it was a few sentences. He had a very good memory and what was available in the libraries and the archives. So this I found extremely fascinating. And one of the impressive lists he compiled was the chronology of the Satyagraha campaign, which he perused over 300 files, which were newspaper cuttings from, the Natal Mercury, the Natal Witness. And what struck me also about Dr. Reddy was his passion for writing and documenting histories and contemporary events. And although he was in retirement and had health issues along the way, he never stopped working. He kept the momentum going. I recall in 2010 when Dr. Reddy and I were exchanging emails, and I would write every week or whenever it was work-related or sometimes maybe every third day. But one day, Dr. Reddy received 4 emails from me that morning before 12 noon. And Dr. Reddy was certainly surprised and wrote back to me, that is, and I quote, "That is a record, Kalpana, maybe because I sent you emails over the weekend. I email 7 days a week." That just a few concluding remarks that Dr. Reddy was really an honor working with you on our book, Pioneers of Satyagraha. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, because you also allowed learn in the process, and myself as an academic to the North done a truly authentic and Gandhi. Many who are tuned in tonight should be aware of your work in the South African struggle. You have made a significant contribution to the end through your plans of momentum going. You kept the momentum of the anti-apartheid struggle going. You were dedicated and passionate, and you worked very, very long hours at the UN. But you also left very legacy, not only in your activism, but the rich archival information that you have.
Sorry about this, ladies and gentlemen. It's a poor line on Kalpana's end. I suppose there's a lot more rain on Kalpana's area. So we apologize for that. Prof.
Are you
Reddy,
still with us?
Yes, I'm back.
All right.
Okay.
Carry on.
Okay. Just to add, the final sentence is that you also left a priceless legacy, not only in your activism, but the rich archival information that you have collected and collated. Scholars like myself and others and generations to come will truly be indebted to you for your contribution. So thank you, Dr. Reddy, and stay safe as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalpana, for sharing those very personal insights and relationship you had during the course of the production of that book. It was very good to learn. I just imagined, suppose that we had ES as your supervisor, he would certainly be driving you a bit crazy for working 7 days a week, I guess. Selvan, we still have a little time. Can we proceed as we hear Betty's poem?
yes, please. It's not often that we have Dr. ES with us, so I think while it's earlier on in Boston, it'll be great to continue for a short while. So we'd love to hear from Betty, and there would be a few questions if people would indulge with us regarding time.
All right. Betty, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
All good.
Thank you, Professor Jairam Reddy, and thank you, Selvan Naidoo, for arranging this program. Dr. Anuga Reddy and fellow distinguished guests, thank you for this opportunity to participate in this worthy tribute to a great icon of freedom in our world. And thank you to the panelists we've just heard. You've really woven a rich tapestry around the work of Dr. Reddy. My late husband and I were privileged to meet Dr. Anuga in New York City many years ago through the facilitation of my cousin and his wife, Professor Edward and Kavitha Ramsamy, both from Rutgers University. You'll remember them well, Dr. Reddy. In the poem I've composed, there are many allusions from various sources. Dr. Anuga was deeply committed to the freedom struggle in South Africa. Above this, he was a great Pan-Africanist who understood that Black lives matter. My poem was actually composed in 2010 when Dr. Anuga was awarded the Gandhi Prize for Justice and Reconciliation by the Gandhi Development Trust. You'll remember that occasion, Ela. I want to thank Comrade Wally Serote for his moving poem, for invoking the spirit of OR and the many ancestors of our freedom. We are really united in a particular way at this time as we gather around Dr. ES Reddy. And so my poem. For Anuga Srinivasalu Reddy. From little Palapali to the halls of power in New York City, you strode the world in giant leaps, driven across continents, heavy with the world's woes, the cries from the coolie lines under the African sky. You would not relent until justice was won and truth found a resting place. With Gandhi under your skin, with the voices of Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois reaching your soul, looking on darkness you found the meaning of living in freedom's cause. You sought to defeat through stratagem and diligence the debauchery of empires. Your African dream that the beloved continent is set free from the yoke of tyranny. Your relentless odyssey over the black waters to free Mandela and write the epitaph on fear. Your name is now writ large in the nation's sky. The winter is past. The rain is over and gone. Flowers appear on the earth, and the time of singing has come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. Selvan, other panelists, would like to raise some questions or comments, or ES yourself would like to say something that, that we had omitted, that's something of interest to any of us, please. We've got about 10 minutes or so, Selvan, what we call an open session.
Correct. I think it would be open for questions, and we'd love to hear a lot from Dr. ES Reddy.
I think the covered most of the things. I would only like to say it was a long struggle in South Africa. It was a long struggle in exile, and the end was satisfying. Thank you.
Any comments from any of the other panelists? Sam, we probably, we might have cut short to something that you in your speech that we had omitted, that you want to complete it now. I think we've lost Sam's audio. Selvan?
Yes. Kiru, you had that question on Papaseugulum, which I'm very interested on. Could you possibly ask that question again so that Dr. Reddy could hear more about, or tell us more about that time on Papaseugulum?
Or Sam might be able to fill in something on that as well.
Thank you, Jairam, and thank you, Selvan. Of course, that was a turning point as far as denting elements of apartheid in the country. But I'm certain Enuga Reddy also has a certain narration to that. But that's been very, very important for all of us in South Africa, not only for people of Indian origin, but people who are not white. And of course, previous to that, not very many know, and there's probably history now, and I don't think any one of those people were involved in 1957, when the South African Table Tennis Board sent a team to Sweden to take part in the World Table Tennis Championships. And again, and I think Enuga already also knows a little bit about that, and it'd be nice to ask Enuga regarding that particular point, because I think the last surviving member of that team that went to Sweden in 1957 was Ashwin Valji. Apparently he died a few years ago, or maybe a year ago. And that was a big breakthrough for denting not only apartheid sport, but denting apartheid, because many people forget that it was the element of sport that, and maybe Enuga Reddy can comment on this, that really dented apartheid, because it affected openly the white community in South Africa. Because when it came to sanctions, diplomatic sanctions or trade sanctions or arms sanctions, those were done on a bilateral basis. But sport had to be done on a multilateral basis, and that is why sport had such a wide type of media coverage compared to everything else. Maybe Enuga can probably comment on that.
Enuga, you want to comment on that sports dimension?
Yes. I think it was around 1957 that Indians who won this first competition were given their prizes, not in the club, but outside in the rain. That got enormous publicity and let people know what apartheid is. This was before the forced boycott and sanctions against South Africa, but it did lay a basis for actions against apartheid. So it was a very important event. Thank you.
As you are reflecting, I just want to make a comment. I mean, Inuga spent 35 years, at the United Nations, mainly devoted to the struggle against apartheid. And I think he retired sometime in 1985. But the next 35 years, 25, 30 years, he spent in writing and scholarship, in documentation. It's almost like two separate careers. He went on from one, and his retirement years was really rich and engaging time that he spent, not only in the United States, but with so many scholars across the world as we had this evening. And that has been, I think, a remarkable achievement of Mr. Reddy.
I think there's two hands up. Before I get to Dr. Betty,
right.
Auntie Ila, you've got your hand up. So would you like to ask your question?
Or comment?
Yeah, just two things. Firstly, I was reading again one of your books, ES, this one here, Vision of a Free South Africa. And in this book, you have published a number of letters that Gandhiji wrote to the Maltinos and Emily Hobhouse and so on. Now, recently, I believe that the Maltino papers have been published. And I was just wondering whether your letters were published together with those, or is it two separate, because it's nice to have both sides together, the response from Gandhiji and what Emily might have written to Gandhiji. So, to see both sides of it. I just wanted to know whether whether both were printed or is it just the one side? That's the one question. And I just wanted to raise this issue about Papua New Guinea. I know at that time I was at university, and I know that it was very controversial. The whole issue of whether, any Black person should be participating in apartheid sports. So I know that there was a move in the country from a lot of people who had sacrificed, like if you take the swimming group and so on, many of them refused to participate in those competitions because they were segregated. So there was I remember at that time that some people supported him and others were very much against what he had done. I just wanted to put that on the table.
I think in the first part you had, a question to ES, am I right?
Yes.
Yes, I don't know if you heard that or you want her to repeat it.
Can you repeat it?
Could you just repeat the question succinctly?
The Maltino papers.
Letters that were published.
I don't think I'm not sure if
no, I think regrettably He hasn't heard that.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think the acoustics are not as good and he's not picking it up.
I can answer that question. Gandhi had correspondence with white women, European women, who supported this struggle. That was very typical of Gandhi because he didn't think of Indians or colored or Europeans as separate. It was a common struggle, common commitment against racism. So I published that, and I'm glad it got attention.
Great. If we could go to Dr. Betty.
Thank you. I wanted to thank the panelists for highlighting the different categories of histories that Dr. Reddy has focused on and the documentation he's provided. I just wanted to stress something that has really impressed me about Dr. Reddy's work and his struggle, and that's his attention not only to the plight of Indians in South Africa, but also to the plight of the African mine workers in South Africa. And also I wanted to highlight the very important role and the stories not told enough of his work in the independence struggles of the African countries in the rest of the continent. And I think that there's a lot of research and documentation and gathering of information that could be done of the kind of work that Dr. Reddy himself was doing for a long part of the 20th century. And the wonderful stories of independence from the 60s are all the result of the work of so many people, and he features strongly among them. I wonder if anyone would like to comment on that or perhaps give a response.
May I just add a rejoinder to Betty's comment and question?
Thank you.
Go ahead, Kiru.
Yeah, no, just, I mean, as we were reflecting just on the scope of Dr. Reddy's work, I was very struck by his correspondence. I think it was with General Constant Viljoen, identifying the Boer graves in Sri Lanka, and I think there were also Boer prisoners of war in India. So just, you know, the fact of that correspondence early in the 1990s, at the time during the constitutional negotiations, I think that bringing forward that kind of information did a great deal to soften the attitude of a very important Afrikaner leader. And I know that Dr. Serote himself in the Freedom Park project in which he drew so many of us in, was also at great pains to note all of the diverse contributions of various freedom struggles. And in one context, you know, the Anglo-Boer War was can be construed in that category as well. It doesn't equate with the. Certainly, I think that identification of Boer graves was an important part of Dr. ES Reddy's work. Just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Kalpana, you weren't very audible, regrettably, because of the poor connection. There were times that you came in and out. Possibly, if there's anything that you'd like to add now.
Yes, I just wanted to ask Dr. Reddy one quick question. You know, a few days ago, we celebrated June 16th Youth Day, and I was wondering, Dr. Reddy, what would be your advice? What advice would you give to the youth in South Africa today, given the many challenges we are facing?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I will say that I was looking around the graves in cemetery in India. I was surprised to find South African graves. I had thought that South Africans are buried there. So I looked at as many as I could and prepared a note on the article on the South African race in India. It was published in South Africa and got attention. So I was very happy that I was able to do that service to history. Then the second question, what advice do I have for the youth?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think they should follow their own conscience, their own knowledge, and do what they can for their generation and for the later generations. Thank you.
Perhaps, Kalpana, the best thing our youth can do probably learn a little bit by studying the life of ES and seeing the kind of role model that he was in the work that he did.
Yes, our older generation.
Sorry, go ahead, Kalpana.
I said our older generation know very well some of the names and people who participated and who did a lot for the liberation struggle. But the younger generation still have a lot, to be informed, particularly in terms of, who participated and what the liberation movement was, in various aspects.
Anything else, anybody? Selvan, I think it's time to bring this to a conclusion now.
Yes, correct. If there's anyone else that would like to have a parting shot and be able to articulate your questions or comments very quickly, mindful that we are now have passed 2 hours into our program. So we'd like, your last words on or comments regarding the program.
Thank you, Selvan. If I can quickly mention, I wonder if any work has been done on the kind of onslaught that must have been conducted against Dr. Reddy and his people like Sam Ramsamy by the apartheid agents and the kind of people they employed against y'all while y'all did what y'all had to do against apartheid South Africa. Thank you.
If I were to just come in very briefly, please, Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Wally.
I was wondering what it is, having listened very closely to everything that was said, and wondering what it is that we should do to break down the wall between what is being said here and generally what is happening in the country.
Yeah.
In terms of access to information, access to this very, very rich knowledge of our country, crisscrossing it across the barriers which exist from apartheid. It would seem to me that that is extremely important for us to open discussions about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank comrades Wally Serote because that was at the back of my comments as well. When you read this history and the role that Dr. ES Reddy played in it, you are deeply moved at the camaraderie. There were true comrades across all the race divisions. And this is something we need to understand and learn for today. And this legacy that we have, how do we make it manifest now and make this a lived reality now? That's our cry.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, if we could possibly have a few other people that could end off. Uma, would you like to say something? Okay, I think most people are quite happy with their comments or questions. Prof. Jairam, I'd leave it to you to end the session.
Yeah, all it left for me to really thank all of the panelists for the rich input they have given from different perspectives, you know, from reminiscences, from writing together, from documentation, from a historical point of view, from a sports point of view, etc., etc. I think it's been a unique privilege for us to have had in our midst in this evening webinar a man with a heritage as rich as ES Reddy, that has given us, you know, the opportunity to discuss and talk with him this evening. I think it's been extremely rich, and I want to thank ES very, very much for spending the last 2 hours with us. And I want to wish you everything of the best, many years of happy times in Boston, and I'm looking forward to be there about this time next year and to go one of those restaurants that Sam was talking about with you. But with that, let me again thank, you know, Selvan for putting this program together. And I don't know if Nirod is still here. Thank the board again for hosting this at the 1860 Heritage Center. And for all of you, good night and stay safe. And thank you again.
Good night, Chair. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, yes, and say thank you to the family as well.
Thank you.
Right. To Mina, especially, who has been corresponding with us, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kelvin, Kiru, everybody.
Okay, you can leave.
Come
Bye.
later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thanks.
Bye.